Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be comparing a medium and a fine stainless steel Schmidt nib. I'll be doing a writing sample with each on Rhodia 5mm grid paper. I'm going to dip each nib in Ackerman Israel Zablau. The medium nib is the nib that came on my Visconti Mirage Mythos, and the fine nib is just a Schmidt branded replacement nib. I'm going to begin with the medium nib, and when I get done with both writing samples, I'll talk about what I like and don't like about these Schmidt nibs. This medium nib feels pleasantly chalky on this Rhodia paper, and it's smooth in every direction. The reverse writing, I had to do a little smoothing on it, but now it puts down a very nice, uniform, extra fine line. Overall, this is a very enjoyable nib. Now I'm going to remove the medium nib. It's a threaded nib unit, so I'll just take it out and put in the fine. But first, let me make sure that I remove the converter. I'm going to get inky in this process. Okay, when dipping a nib to test it, if you end up with something like this, that's just a sign I need to dip it a little bit more, really make sure the nib is saturated. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, very dry on the upward stroke. I was noticing that this felt so dry compared to the medium, and I just thought, well, it's a medium nib. It's going to feel a little bit smoother, but this dry upstroke, I'm feeling that in the writing. And the stroke to the right feels a bit dry. Yeah, and the reverse writing is too dry to be usable, but with a fine nib like this, I'm not usually reverse writing anyway, and that's not uncommon. It's kind of hit and miss, even with larger nibs, whether it's going to be a usable reverse writer. But this dry upstroke, I think I just need to, I'm going to dip this again because I want to give it a fair shake. Well, that's interesting. I've really held this nib down in the ink and given it every opportunity to really saturate the feed. One of the observations I have about both of these nibs, these Schmidt nibs, is that they feel kind of soft and bouncy, almost like a gold nib. If you didn't tell me otherwise and gave me either of these nibs to write with, I might think it was a gold nib. So if that's something you're interested in, now let me say this. I am not a flex nib writer. That's not something I'm interested in. I never attempt to flex a nib. It might feel soft and bouncy because it might be a thinner metal in this nib. It might spring easier, so that's not something I would recommend. I wouldn't recommend trying to flex this. Consult someone else that's more of an authority on that if that's something you're interested in. But if you're just interested in a soft, cushiony writing experience, I would recommend these. Now, do note, I don't know if this is a characteristic of all the fine nibs, but this is very similar to the way my Pilot 14 karat fine nibs write, the number 5 size. They have those dry upstrokes. Now, the difference between this fine nib and my Pilot fine nibs is that the Pilot nibs are much smoother. This is more of a chalky writing experience, so this dry bit here it's bordering on unpleasant for me. I much prefer the medium nib. The medium nib is wet in every direction. You get that chalky feeling, but it's very pleasant. I'm a little bit disappointed in this nib, in the fine nib. I was expecting it to feel more like the reverse writing on my medium nib. Whenever I'm writing with this medium nib, I do a fair amount of small writing, so I'm writing with it quite a bit in reverse, and it's able to keep up and does just fine. So that's why I went ahead and purchased this fine nib. I thought, well, if I'm going to be writing in reverse, I might as well just invest in a fine nib. But now this ink is a drier writing ink, and that's why I put it in the medium nib. Let me talk about one of the things I disliked about this medium nib. When I first got it on this pen, it was a gusher, and not in a good way. It wrote so wet that the inks I was writing with were feathering on even good fountain pen friendly paper. So I had to remove the nib. I rinsed it out really well, tried it again, still gushing. I looked at it with a loop and noticed that the tines were parallel. They didn't come together any at all. They look like this. And the ink was just pouring out. So I removed the nib from the feed and kind of worked with them, bending each one down a little at a time until I got the tines just barely touching put it back in the feed. I'm not sure now if they're actually touching or if they're maybe just a little bit of a gap. But with this ink, it writes perfect now. And that's one of the downsides. I love this nib. I'm glad I have it. I enjoy writing with it. But if it were earlier on in my fountain pen hobby, I wouldn't have known to do that. And even if I were able to watch some videos with a pen at this price point, even though by Visconti standards, it's one of the budget pens, I probably wouldn't have felt comfortable removing the nib, pulling stuff apart. So that's something to consider. But if you're comfortable doing stuff like this, it's well worth the investment. You can work with it and get it in a shape that you want it in. So that's probably something I'm going to have to do here. I'm probably going to have to do the opposite, spread the tines out a little bit. But I do like the line width, and I think that is something I can correct, because now that I think about it, Benu uses Schmidt nibs, and I hear people raving about their fine nibs all the time. They have really good fine nibs. The thing is, I'm pretty sure they test and tune their nibs in-house before they send them out. I know that Visconti has had issues in the past with their quality control. Now, at this stage, they're saying that their gold nibs are in-house gold nibs. I'm talking about Visconti right now. But I've also heard from someone that their gold nibs are actually Jowo gold nibs, but that they tune them in-house. And so that's something I think they need to consider doing for these Schmidt nibs. That's something that any pen maker, I think, needs to be doing, especially at this price point. Visconti's more of a luxury brand. I don't think any pen maker should just take a nib that they're buying from another manufacturer, slap it on a pen, and send it out. Especially at this price point, they need to be tuning them in-house before they send them out. Okay, I've been working with this for a few minutes, and I'm not sure how to fix it. I tried to spread the tines a little bit, but I started noticing that I don't really need the downstrokes to be any wetter. The side strokes to the right are okay, and the upstrokes are just dry. And to the right, they're a bit drier than the first two, but I guess okay. But those upstrokes, you just really feel it, and it makes the overall writing experience, it takes away from it. I tried smoothing the nib a little bit on some micro mesh to get rid of that feeling, but I'm still feeling, when you're writing, you don't notice that it's just the upstroke that's dry. You just feel an unpleasantness to it. And when you try each stroke individually and can really isolate where the problem is, So, I know it's not an issue with all Schmidt fine nibs, because like I mentioned with Benu, their fine nibs are one of the ones that people are just really happy with. I'm just going to have to do a little more research and find out how you correct something like that, because it's not just a matter of making it write wetter, because the downstroke is wet enough. In fact, I don't know. Well, yeah, I don't want it a whole lot wetter than that. That defeats the purpose of having a fine nib. All right, it's the next day, and I did some research on how to fix a nib that's writing dry upstrokes, and I couldn't find anything that specific. There's information on how to fix a dry writing nib or a wet writing nib or a misaligned nib, but I couldn't find anything on how to fix a nib that's writing with a dry upstroke. So I decided I needed to floss the nib with a brass shim. Maybe that could help. Maybe that could spread the tines a little bit. And so I did that, and maybe, let's see, that's how it was writing before. And that's after I did the brass shim, but it still felt kind of dry. It was looking a little better. And I was kind of playing around with it. And I purposely wrote with very little pressure. Like, you know, a fountain pen, if it's tuned properly, you should be able to just drag it across the page and it writes properly. Well, when I checked it out, my pen was actually writing dry in every direction. I was unconsciously writing with some pressure in these initial writing samples. There it was, after flossing with no pressure, still writing a little bit too light and felt dry. So I decided to use Doug Rathbun's method of writing with pressure for 7 pen strokes and then testing it. And so I did that with no pressure. It's looking a little better, but still felt dry. So I did it again. A little bit more ink is coming out, but still felt dry. Again, now it's looking really good. Still felt just a little bit dry though. One more time, and I'm getting a consistent amount of ink in all directions, and it's feeling really nice. It's got that same chalky feedback that the medium nib has, but it just feels really pleasant. So I've just got it dipped in ink, so let me see if it'll write. This is the replacement nib. And this nib, like the medium nib, has a bit of bounce to it. I wouldn't call it flex, and I wouldn't try to flex it, but especially with this ink, I'm getting just little hints of line variation. And even the reverse writing is a little bit darker. I'm getting just a little bit more ink, so I went ahead and smoothed out the back of the nib. It's very fine, but the ink flow is consistent. I don't anticipate I'll ever need this fine of a line, but if I do need it, it's available. Compared to my Pilot Extra Fine, either the Extra Fine Steel nib or the Extra Fine nib in the Vanishing Point, this fine nib is quite a bit wider than that. But it is finer than the medium nib. And it's just really well suited for this dry Ackerman ink. These two just go really well together. I'm happy I was able to get this to work. I'm excited about using these two together. I won't have the Visconti branding. This Visconti nib is nice and clean, nice looking, but this nib I feel like is well suited for this pen. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.